Thank you for joining us as we explore one of the most unsettling instances in American history. We're going to unravel a story that has been unsolved for over a century, so please let us know where you are watching. We are discussing a mystery that started on a chilly November night in 1901 and continues to haunt the dusty archives of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. The United States industrial heartland at the time was Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh expanded like a blazing furnace. Its chimneys spewed dark smoke that grayed the sky day and night. However, there were areas where modernity had not yet arrived with its electric light and telegraphs, far away from the cacophonous factories and streets full of laborers. And it all started in one of these abandoned locations. Known for its thick forests and meandering paths that wound through deep valleys, the hilly area north of Pittsburgh was renowned. The residents were farmers, lumberjacks, and ordinary people who hardly ever traveled to the large city. They had to rely on one another. The towns withdrew and waited for spring to reopen the roads when winter arrived early, as it did that year. Martha Crowley vanished in this environment. Living alone on a small property inherited from her family, she was 28 years old and widowed after her husband perished in a sawmill accident 3 years prior. Martha's expertise with medicinal herbs was well known in the area. People traveled great distances to see her getting ready for stomach problems, pains, and fevers. She was well respected, had a good reputation, and had never raised suspicion. Martha was last observed strolling along the road that led to the Henshaw property on November 16, 1901, in the afternoon. The Henshaw family lived roughly 3 kilometers away from Martha's house. She was wearing her brown woolen shawl, which everyone knew from a distance, and she had a basket wrapped in a white cloth. Martha was seen that afternoon, according to 3 witnesses. As the sun started to set, she waved to the blacksmith's wife as she passed his home and carried on. Martha never returned home, and she never reached the Henoris. Landlady Henshaw thought it odd that Martha hadn't arrived, but she wasn't worried right away. Maybe she had reconsidered. Maybe she went home because she didn't feel well. However, when she visited Martha's property the following day to make sure, she discovered that the house was locked, the chickens in the coop were hungry, and there was no indication that anyone had brought back the last evening. The panic began to spread at that point. The local men quickly banded together. They organized search parties that thoroughly examined the entire road, the nearby forests, the streams, and the ravines. They spent days looking. Martha's basket was never located. The brown shawl was never found. No fabric fragment, no obvious footprint, no indication of resistance or flight. Martha Crowley seemed to have vanished into the chilly November air. The Allegheny County Sheriff, A. The investigation was personally led by a man by the name of Thomas Bridger. In addition to his perseverance, Bridger was renowned for his skepticism. He didn't think disappearances that couldn't be explained were real. There was always someone behind it, in his opinion. He was determined to find both motives, which were always present. A drifter who had been spotted in the area days prior to the disappearance was initially suspected. A gray-bearded, middle-aged man in tattered clothes who slept in barns with permission and begged for food at farms. However, when? The man had a strong alibi, and Bridger eventually found him in a small town 30 kilometers away. He was working on a farm the day Martha vanished, and 5 different people saw him doing it. After that, Bridger focused on the neighbors. He addressed each person who knew Martha individually. The more he questioned, the more he realized there was something that no one wanted to say. And that's when things started to get weird. All conversations were marred by an awkward silence. Avoided looks, ambiguous responses. It seemed as though everyone was aware of something but had agreed in private to keep it to themselves. In December, winter came in full force, blanketing everything in a deep layer of snow. It was necessary to halt the searches. Bridger persevered, but now he was forced to wait. Hold off until the snow melts. Await the answers that spring will bring. Silence was replaced by something much worse in the spring of 1902. When March 1902 finally arrived, and the snow started to fall off the hills in Pennsylvania, Sheriff Bridger. With newfound vigor, he resumed his search. Something still bothered him after he had spent the winter going over every detail, every testimony, and every piece of information he had collected. That quiet, that sense that everyone was more aware than they were expressing. At that point, a second individual vanished. Elelena Vance was a seamstress who was 32 years old. A few kilometers from where Martha had last been seen, she resided in a rented home on the outskirts of Millvale, a small village. Elelena lived alone, was unmarried, and made her living by sewing for the wealthier families in the area. She was a quiet, reserved woman who hardly ever smiled. Elelena informed her landlady that she was going to deliver dresses to 2 nearby farms on the morning of March 23rd. Her neatly folded orders were stored in a large cloth bag she carried. She had on a dark hat and a gray coat. She was seen by 3 people strolling down the main road and politely waving at acquaintances. Vance, Elelena, never went back to the house. The alarm went off right away this time. The disappearance of Martha still shook people. And now there was another woman who had disappeared completely. The area was overcome with panic. Even during the day, families started locking their doors. Women began to avoid going for walks by themselves. And the rumors started spreading more and more. Even more thorough than the earlier searches, Bridger planned new ones. He brought men from Pittsburgh this time, along with seasoned trackers and even a few sniffer dogs that had been. Trained to locate individuals who have gone missing, they expanded the search area by going through the same woods and paths. 2 days later, they discovered Elelena's purse, left behind by a stream that sliced through the forest. The purse held nothing. The dresses she was carrying had vanished, but there were no indications that she had been dragged or made to go anywhere, nor were there any signs of violence or a struggle. Elelena appeared to have just dropped her bag there and entered the woods on her own initiative, which obviously made no sense at all. Newspapers in Pittsburgh started to report on the cases. Sensational headlines described women who disappeared like smoke, a predator in the hills, and hidden hazards on rural roads. Fear swept across the area. The sheriff's office received letters on a daily basis. Some offered assistance, some offered ridiculous theories, and many just expressed fear. In the midst of this escalating paranoia, Bridger got an unexpected visit. An old man who simply called himself Mr. On a soggy April afternoon, Whitmore showed up at the sheriff's office. He claimed to have knowledge of the disappearances, but he would only discuss it in private. He was taken to a closed room by Bridger, and what he heard there drastically altered the investigation's direction. According to Whitmore, there was an abandoned property in the hills that locals had shunned for years. The house had belonged to a family that abruptly and mysteriously left the area decades ago, leaving everything behind. The property had been in ruins ever since. However, there were long-standing rumors about that location. Rumors that nobody wanted to say out loud. Whitmore claimed to have heard strange noises resonating among the nearby trees, dim lights in the broken windows, smoke rising from the chimney at night, and movement on the property recently. Although he had no idea who was there, he believed Bridger ought to look into it. Then Whitmore said something that made the sheriff's blood run cold before he left. He claimed that women had gone missing in that area before. Bridger rummaged through the county's old archives all night long until he found what he was searching for: 3 women had vanished under similar circumstances between 1887 and 1889. Everyone lived alone. They were all last seen strolling down country roads. They were all lost. The sheriff in charge at the time had carried out fruitless investigations, and the cases were eventually forgotten and buried under mountains of dusty documents. Bridger, however, now had a firm lead. He had a location to look into. He assembled 6 reliable men the next morning and headed for the deserted estate. The old trail was encroached upon by thick vegetation, making the path challenging. When they eventually arrived, they discovered a run-down wooden house with moss-covered walls and a partially collapsed roof. There were footprints in the mud surrounding the house, but the windows were broken and the front door was only hinged. A person had been there. With caution, Bridger and his men went inside. The interior smelled of damp earth and mildew, and it was cold and dark. Fresh ashes in the fireplace, leftover food on a makeshift table, and a blanket spread out on one of the room's floors were all obvious indications that someone had recently used the space. Then, in the basement, they discovered something that made everyone shudder. A narrow, rotten wooden staircase led to the cellar, creaking with each step. Bridger was the first to fall, clutching a lantern that illuminated the damp stone walls with dancing shadows. He couldn't quite place the peculiar odor of the thick, heavy air down there. He would rather not identify it, but it was a combination of churned-up earth and something more eerie. The men had to hunch their backs because of the cramped quarters and low ceiling. In one corner were stacked crates encrusted with ancient cobwebs. On the walls, rusty tools dangled from hooks. And something caused Bridger to pause in the middle of the basement. His footprints. There was a hole about 1 meter wide that was dug in the hard-packed earth. Without more research, its depth cannot be determined. The earth around it was damp and dark, recently disturbed. Additionally, there was a partially buried piece of brown fabric next to the hole. Bridger saw it right away. The shawl Martha Crowley was wearing on the day she vanished was made of the same kind of fabric. Using shovels they discovered in the basement, his men started to carefully dig. With every earthly stratum removed, the tension rose. Nobody said anything. The men's labored breathing and the sound of their tools slicing through the ground were the only sounds. For hours they dug deeper and deeper until they eventually came to a solid surface. It was not what they had anticipated. There was a sort of tunnel at the bottom of the hole, a small horizontal passageway that had been dug with crude tools and was tenuously supported by old planks. A man could not walk through the tunnel standing upright because it was too shallow. It led to him having to crawl. Somewhere deep in the ground, vanishing into complete blackness. Every face on Bridger's men was marked with fear. He knew he had no choice but to enter, even though none of them wanted to. The solution was at the end of that tunnel if there was any chance of locating Martha and Eleanor, if there was any chance of learning the truth. With his flashlight in front of him, he crawled inside by himself. Bridger moved forward through the confined passageway. His body was pressed on both sides by the earthen walls. The low ceiling was adorned with roots that brushed his back. The farther he went, the thinner the air became. In his ears, he could hear his own heart thumping. Despite the cold, he could feel the perspiration trickling down his face. The tunnel led to a larger chamber after what felt like an eternity. Raising his flashlight, Bridger was completely frozen by what he saw. The chamber was a 3-meter diameter area that was dug out for a specific purpose. The walls were covered in thoughtfully placed stones, as though it had been painstakingly constructed over time. Personal items were arranged in an almost ceremonial fashion on a wooden structure in the center that resembled a table or makeshift altar. An empty wicker basket, a dirty brown shawl, a gray coat with wooden buttons, pieces of cloth that appeared to have been used, women's shoes, multiple pairs arranged side by side, and numerous other items that had obviously belonged to different People over time, but no bodies were found. No remains were found. Nothing pointed to the missing women's ultimate fate. Bridger's hands trembled as he studied each item. His eyes found Martha's shawl. There were other items there, likely belonging to the women who had vanished years earlier in 1887 and 1889, and possibly even older items that had never been reported. But he recognized the coat that witnesses had described Elelonena wearing. On the chamber's walls, there were carved marks. Instead of words, they were odd symbols, repeated patterns that didn't immediately make sense. Shaking as he drew, Bridger copied a few of them into his notebook. Additionally, dates, years, 1887, 1889, 1901, and vertical lines that appeared to be counting something were engraved next to each date. Bridger was pale and drenched in perspiration when he eventually came out of the tunnel. His men gave him support and asked him pressing questions, but he was unable to speak clearly at first. He had to take a seat. Before he could describe what he had discovered, he needed to calm down, take a deep breath, and gather his thoughts. Everything changed when that subterranean chamber was found. It was more than two separate disappearances now. It was a much larger, multi-decade project that was meticulously planned and carried out by someone who was intimately familiar with the area. However, who? And now, where was that individual? Bridger gave his men orders to guard the deserted property. If someone went back there, they would be apprehended. He returned to his office and started assembling the puzzle in the meantime. He went over all the information from previous investigations, searched for trends, and attempted to make connections between the victims that went beyond the obvious. Then he came to a vital realization. Apart from living alone, all the missing women had something in common. Every single one of them had last been spotted strolling in the same general direction toward the hills. Though not precisely the same route, they consistently converge in the same area where there was an abandoned property. They seemed to be drawn there by someone. However, how and why? Bridger reintegrated all those who had seen the disappearances for days, and with the new knowledge in hand, he started to exert more pressure this time. It was impossible for so much to occur without anyone noticing anything suspicious, he insisted. So someone had to know something. He was able to end the silence in this way. On a cloudy afternoon, Bridger was approached by a woman named Sarah Brennan. In May, with a dark veil covering her face, she showed up at the sheriff's office and requested a private conversation. When she finally started talking, her voice was barely audible, and her hand shook as she held the cup of tea he offered her. According to Sarah, there was a man in the area who she only knew as Dr. Monroe. Because he claimed to know about herbs and treatments that traditional medicine overlooked, he was referred to as a doctor, even though he wasn't one. Monroe had been featured in the came from nowhere in the area around 1885 and made their home in a tiny remote cabin in the hills. He was initially viewed with suspicion. His light eyes seemed to see right through people, and he was a tall, slender man. He didn't say much and didn't smile much, but over time, some residents started to trust him. He provided cures for ailments that the city's physicians were unable to treat. He seemed to have results and charged little or nothing. According to Sarah, her own sister had sought advice from Monroe years prior when she was experiencing ongoing pain that was unrelieved by any treatment. After Monroe gave her a herbal remedy, the pain subsided. Though he always maintained his distance from the community, he became well known because other people had similar stories. However, Monroe had a peculiar quality. He appeared particularly drawn to single women. He would visit their homes to offer assistance with heavy lifting, house maintenance, and winter firewood. He was always courteous, never charged anything, and always helpful, and the women started to trust him because they were appreciative of his assistance. Sarah paused for a long time before speaking again. Then she disclosed what had actually led her there. In 1889, her sister, whom Monroe had treated, vanished. She was among the unidentified women. Bridger had found one of the old cases in the files. Sarah had always had suspicions about Monroe, but she was never brave enough to voice them. She was terrified. He was feared by everyone due to rumors and whispers that spread only in the most intimate discussions. Monroe was described as more than just a healer. They claimed that he engaged in weird rituals in his cabin, that he thought there were evil forces that lived in the earth's depths, and that he was looking for some sort of knowledge that was off limits and could only be acquired by means of practices that no one dared to explicitly identify. Bridger listened in silence, taking note of everything. After Sarah was done, he commended her bravery and said he would look into it. Sarah shook her head when he asked the pivotal question, where was Monroe now? Nobody was certain. A few months prior to Martha's disappearance in October 1901, he had vanished from view. Despite the fact that his cabin was deserted, some people claimed to have seen him on occasional ways in the distance, always at night moving ghostly along the paths on the hillside. Bridger launched a more extensive operation using this new knowledge. From Pittsburgh, he brought in reinforcements. Equipped and seasoned men, he coordinated methodical searches across the area, paying particular attention to the most isolated parts of the hills, and he found Monroe's old cabin. Compared to the deserted property where they had discovered the tunnel, the location was even more remote. To get there, one had to climb a steep slope covered in thick pine trees, cross 2 streams, and follow nearly invisible trails. The cabin itself was compact and remarkably intact, with a wooden shingle roof that had withstood the test of time and sturdy logs. The passage of time. The interior of the door was locked. When Bridger and his men broke through the door, they discovered something unsettling. The cabin was bare and nearly deserted. There was a chair, a small table, and a basic bed in one corner. All the walls were covered with shelves that held glass jars filled with powdered materials of different colors, dried herbs, and roots. Dozens of books were also present, carefully arranged in stacks. Bridger looked through the books. The majority were in English, but some were in other languages. Didn't identify. The title mentioned mystical practices, ancient philosophies, and theories regarding the nature of existence and consciousness. Monroe had left remarks about what he was reading in the margins, written in tiny, exact handwriting. Bridger discovered notebooks and diaries on a desk in the corner, where Monroe kept track of her ideas and experiments. It was there that the horrifying truth started to come to light. Monroe thought he had uncovered a basic aspect of human nature. He composed. Regarding the potential for achieving a higher state of consciousness through what he dubbed separation rituals and for transcending physical existence, he had been testing his theories for years, constantly looking for volunteers to take part in his experiments, according to his notes. However, Bridger quickly discovered that there were no real volunteers. Monroe had a unique talent for spotting lonely, vulnerable people who were in dire need of a purpose or connection. His consideration and kindness won them over, and he gained their trust over the course of months or even years, and when he felt they were ready, he took them to the subterranean chamber on the deserted property. What took place there? Monroe used ambiguous, philosophical language. He was discussing transcendence, emancipation, and stepping over imperceptible boundaries. However, he never gave a detailed explanation of what he did. He never gave a detailed account of the rituals. He seemed to intentionally leave gaps in the documents, as though he wished to keep some sort of secret, even in his private journals. However, it was evident that none of the women who took part in these rituals ever came back, and Monroe wrote about it as though it were normal, expected, and even desirable, as though they had found exactly what they were seeking. As he read, Bridger's stomach turned. He was confronted with the admissions of a man who was obviously troubled, and who had used a perverted philosophy to justify horrible deeds. However, the most crucial component remained absent. Now, where was Monroe? Moreover, more significantly, where were Elelanina and Martha? 3 days prior to Elelanina Vance's disappearance, on March 20th, 1902, Monroe made her final journal entry. He wrote about a premonition, albeit a developing sense that his work was being watched, and that the forces he had studied so thoroughly were going to unveil something significant. He stated that he was getting ready for a last ceremony, which he explained was the result of decades of study and testing. Bridger gave his. Men to examine the entire cabin. They discovered something important after lifting floorboards, searching the walls for secret passageways, and going through each book for maps or hidden pages. A thorough illustration of the area with distinct markings that appeared to denote significant spots. In addition to the circle that marked the abandoned property, there were other markings. Scattered throughout the hills are tiny X's with dates attached. Bridger recorded a total of 12 markings. 12 dates in various locations over nearly 20 years. The realization that he was viewing a visual record of all the disappearances sent shivers down his spine. On the map, however, was the 13th marker. Even farther into the hills, in a place that few people knew, it was in a remote area. Monroe had written the single word portal next to this marker. Bridger made the decision that they had to look into that location right away. He assembled his finest soldiers, examined their weapons, and brought enough supplies to spend the night in the hills if needed. Following the directions on the map, they set out at dawn the following day. The trip was difficult. As they progressed, the terrain became more rugged and steep. They traveled through regions where the trees were so thickly packed that they obstructed nearly all of the sunlight, resulting in a constant twilight that persisted throughout the day. They followed animal tracks where human paths vanished entirely, crossed icy streams, and ascended mosquito-covered rock formations. They spent nearly 6 hours on it, to get to the place indicated on the map, and they realized why Monroe had picked that location when they eventually located it. It was a remarkable natural formation, a rock fissure that spread out like a wound in the ground on a hillside. The gap, which was roughly 2 meters high and 1 meter wide, went deep into the mountain before vanishing into the night. A chilly wind that carried a damp and mineral smell was always blowing from inside the cave, and ice stalagmites hung from the entrance like jagged teeth. Monroe had constructed a ring around the entrance, like an altar, a silver brooch, a faded hairband, a prayer book with worn chants, small personal treasures left there as offerings, and other items obviously belonging to the missing women were strewn across the floor, along with stones arranged in concentric circles and symbols carved into the larger rocks, the same strange patterns Bridger had seen in the underground chamber. Bridger and 3 of his men went into the cave after lighting torches. The entrance was impressive, but so was the interior. The fissure in nature opened into an large underground gallery with a ceiling that rises to a height of maybe 10 meters in some areas. The structure was supported by natural pillars formed by rock formations. A haunting and mesmerizing melody was produced by the continuous sound of dripping water. They moved slowly forward along what must have been a well-traveled path. Years of foot traffic had worn and smoothed the ground in some areas. More carved symbols and markings that Monroe had left to record his obsession were visible on the walls. The primary gallery split off into a number of smaller passageways. Bridger went down, picking the biggest one that appeared to be busiest. Every step made the air colder and the sound of the water louder. It was obvious that they were heading down toward a river that was underground. The tunnel opened into a massive chamber after about 15 minutes of walking. And there, under the torch's flickering light, Bridger at last discovered what he was searching for. There was a makeshift camp in the middle of the room where someone had lived recently, obviously. There was a small pile of firewood next to a freshly extinguished campfire, blankets spread out on the stone floor, and food scraps in a bag dangling from a rock ledge. Thick ropes that sliced into their wrists bound the still warm ashes to a rock formation. Elelena Vance and Martha Crowley were two women who were still alive. They had cracked lips, sunken eyes, and were weak and dehydrated. Their hair was tangled, and their clothes were ripped and filthy. They blinked when their faces were illuminated by the torchlight. With difficulty, as though the light were painful after spending so much time in the dark. To set them free, Bridger and his men hurried. They used knives to cut the ropes, supporting the women when their legs failed, and they were unable to stand. Too weak to even make a sound, Martha started to cry silently. Bridger would never forget the expression on Elenena's face as she stared blankly into space without saying anything. Monroe wasn't there, but it felt like a part of her had been imprisoned in that darkness forever, despite every indication that he had recently been in that room, but he had vanished. Additionally, both Martha and Eleanor shook their heads when they were asked where he was. Eleanor's voice was broken and raspy, and she was only able to whisper a few words. He dug further. Bridger noticed another passageway at the back of the room. This one was distinct from the others. It was steeper, narrower, and obviously natural, unaltered by human hands. And from it came that continuous, now nearly deafening sound of a running water. He knew he needed to continue. Somewhere in the unknown depths of that mountain, he knew Monroe was. However, after observing Martha and Elenena's condition, he realized that saving their lives had to be his top priority. While he and the third man assisted the women in climbing back to the surface, he left the other two men to continue exploring the cave. The trip back was excruciating. Eleanor and Martha were hardly able to walk. It was almost necessary to carry them. Bridger was afraid with every step. They would not survive. But despite the physical trauma, they both had an inner strength that kept them going, a will to live. Martha fell to the ground and embraced the earth as if she would never let go when they eventually came out of the cave and the light of dusk illuminated their faces. They walked down the mountain with Martha and Eleanor for nearly the whole night. With only torches that flickered in the chilly wind blowing through the pines, the return trip was dangerous in the dark. Bridger and his soldiers needed to pause every few minutes to give the women a chance to rest, catch their breath, and regain their strength. With every coughing fit, Elenena's deep cough shook her violently. They continued despite the open wounds on Martha's feet, being covered in improvised rags that soon got soaked with blood. Bridger was profoundly impressed by something about those two women. Despite everything that had happened to them, weeks spent imprisoned in that oppressive darkness and fed barely enough to survive, they still fought with all of their remaining energy, and they didn't moan. They made no request to halt. Their only goal was to get out of that cursed place, so they just put one foot in front of the other. It was past 3 a.m. when they eventually arrived at the main road. A wagon, drawn by 2 powerful horses, was waiting for them at the location where Bridger had dispatched one of his men to retrieve it. After placing Martha and Eleanor on heavy blankets in the back of the wagon, they headed to a doctor's house. Bridger knew in Millvale. Dr. Harrington, a 60-year-old man with white hair and steady hands, had been a surgeon during the Civil War and had witnessed enough atrocities to be unmoved. But when he examined Martha and Elelena that morning, even he palled, not only from the physical injuries which were numerous, the rope marks, the severe dehydration, the infected wounds, but from what he saw in their eyes. There was an emptiness there, an absence he recognized in soldiers who had been prisoners of war for too long. Harrington worked until dawn, tending to the two women. He cleaned their wounds, applied ointments, bandaged their wrists and ankles, administered fluids and medicine for the fever that both had begun to develop. And then, when the sun finally rose over the Pennsylvania hills, he sat down with Bridger and had a difficult conversation. He said that Martha and Alelina would recover physically. It would take time, but their bodies were young and resilient. What worried him was what he couldn't. See, the damage those weeks of captivity had caused to their minds. He had seen this before, this kind of trauma that doesn't heal with bandages and medication, and he warned Bridger that when the time came to interrogate them, he would need patience and sensitivity. Bridger agreed, but he also knew he couldn't wait much longer. The two men he had left exploring the cave still hadn't returned, and with each passing hour, his worry grew. He needed to know what Monroe was planning. He needed to understand what that troubled man intended to do deep within that mountain. While Martha and Alelina slept under the effects of the sedatives Harrington had administered, Bridger returned to his office and began to gather all the information he had collected. He spread documents across his desk: Monroe's diaries, the marked map, the records of old disappearances, the drawings of symbols found in the caves, and he tried to assemble a coherent picture of what he was facing. Monroe wasn't simply a murderer. That was clear now. He was something more complex and perhaps more dangerous. A man consumed by a philosophical obsession he believed to be a quest for transcendental knowledge. He had dedicated decades to exploring those caves, mapping their depths, searching for something he believed existed down there, and the women he took with him weren't random victims. He chose them carefully, prepared them over months, convinced them they were participating in something bigger than themselves. But what exactly was he searching for? In hazy terms, diaries mentioned portals, thresholds between states of consciousness, and the potential to access aspects of life that were disregarded by contemporary science. It was a jumble of distorted philosophy, mysticism, and something on the verge of complete insanity. One specific diary entry from 1898, in which Monroe described a discovery he had made deep within the caves, was one that Bridger read several times. He spoke of discovering a chamber where groundwater created a perfectly still lake that was so deep and black that his torch couldn't illuminate the bottom. He also claimed to have had an experience there that fundamentally altered his perception of reality. Monroe described sensations of detachment, of floating between worlds, of hearing voices that came from nowhere but seemed to emerge from the rock itself. He saw this as proof that he had found a location of power, where the line separating the material world from the other world was less strong, and ever since he had committed his life to attempting to break through that barrier once and for all. In his warped perception, the women he brought with him were willing participants in rites that purportedly made this crossing possible. He spent years identifying and preparing those he deemed suitable because he thought some people were more sensitive to these experiences. He didn't seem to care that none of them ever came back. Instead, he saw it as a victory, evidence that they had successfully transitioned to the opposite side. Bridger rubbed his temples while closing his eyes. He was dealing with the mind of a deeply disturbed individual who had used a belief system that only he could understand to justify horrible deeds. The most terrifying aspect was that Monroe appeared to genuinely believe everything. His writings were devoid of cynicism, remorse, or confessions of guilt. Instead, they were characterized by a strong sense that he was carrying out a vital and significant task. The two men Bridger had abandoned in the caves eventually returned around noon. Came back. They showed up muddy, worn out, and troubled. They reported what they had discovered while seated in the sheriff's office. They had traveled as far as they could through the deepest tunnel. The descent grew steeper and steeper until it became an almost vertical climb, requiring gripping slick rock ledges. As they descended, the sound of the water became unbearable, and eventually, after what they estimated to be a descent of maybe 50 meters, they arrived at the chamber that Monroe had mentioned in his journal. The subterranean lake, a motionless mass of dark water beyond the range of their torches, was real. The surrounding room was round, with a ceiling that rose like a naturally occurring dome sculpted over millennia by water. Damp minerals glistened on the walls, reflecting the torchlight in patterns that were almost mesmerizing. Additionally, they had discovered unmistakable evidence that Monroe had recently visited the lake, the remains of burned candles, burnt campfires, and more of. Those odd inscriptions carved into the nearby rocks, the items placed in a perfect circle around a particular spot on the water's edge, however, were the most unsettling. They included jewelry, small prayer books, brooches, lockets with portraits, wedding rings, and personal items like hair combs. It was obvious that each item had belonged to a distinct individual. In all, the men counted 12 sets of items, 12 women whose lives had been taken over many years. Their most valuable belongings were left there as a ritualistic or macabre memorial. Presenting. Monroe, however, was absent. Only those thoughtfully placed items and the deafening silence of that subterranean room were present. There was no body, no indication of a struggle or accident. The echo had repeatedly returned from the stone walls when the men had called his name, but no one had responded. They had done as much exploring as they could around the lake, but the water was too deep, and there was no safe way to proceed without the right gear. Eventually, as supplies ran out and they began to worry that they might be trapped underground, they made the decision to come out and report what they had discovered. Bridger listened in silence, taking in everything. He then inquired as to whether they had spotted any oddities in the water, any disturbances, or any indication that someone or something might be down there. The men looked at each other uncomfortably. At last, one of them acknowledged that they had indeed observed something odd. There was a moment when the water's flawlessly smooth surface displayed a very slow swirl, as though something was moving in the depths, creating a subtle but detectable current. Additionally, beneath the continuous sound of the dripping water, there was a very faint, nearly undetectable sound that could have been the cave's natural echo, but could also have been something more, a murmur, a vibration, or something that came from far, far below. In order to thoroughly explore the caves, Bridger spent the next few days planning a larger expedition. He was aware that he required skilled personnel, the right tools, and a well-thought-out plan. He couldn't take any more chances. Lives by going into that underground maze unprepared. Under Dr. Harrington's care, Martha and Eleanor started to gradually heal. Eleanina was the first to explain what had happened in a clear and concise manner. 5 days after their rescue, on a soggy afternoon, she requested to talk to Bridger. With his notebook in hand, he sat next to her bed and listened to her narrate her story in a voice that was surprisingly firm, despite still being weak. Eleanina claimed to have met Monroe approximately a year prior. He had shown up at her door offering firewood for the winter, and she had accepted with gratitude, always finding it difficult to do everything by herself. Monroe had been back multiple times, always helpful and kind. He discussed books, philosophy, and existential issues with her that Eleanina had never thought to bring up with anyone. In a way she had never known before, she had felt seen and understood. Monroe eventually started discussing his findings in the caves about locations where reality operated, in a different way where enlarged states of consciousness could be experienced. He promised that she would have a life-changing experience if she came to see these locations, and Eleanor, who was lonely and looking for purpose in her life, agreed. Monroe had shown her a shallow section of the caves during the day, as if it were a valuable secret. He talked about ancient civilizations that supposedly knew those locations before them, and described the meanings of the symbols etched on the walls. Elena felt unique, selected to impart that information. For months, the visits persisted, getting longer and more in-depth. Monroe prepared her for what he referred to as the final experience, by teaching her breathing and meditation techniques. Elena also had total faith in him. He never thought there was any risk. She was never aware that she was being tricked. She had not been coerced on the day of her disappearance. She had voluntarily gone to see Monroe because she thought she would at last take part in the ritual he talked about so much. Elena didn't start to feel afraid until they arrived at the deepest chamber and Monroe tied her to the rock, claiming it was an essential part of the procedure. However, it was already too late. She was in that darkness for weeks. Every now and then, Monroe would descend with a little food and water. He would explain to her that she was being prepared and that isolation and fasting were necessary to purify her body. She would be prepared for the last crossing soon, he said. Elena had attempted to argue, to beg. However, Monroe remained composed and unwavering, as though he were carrying out a holy mission. Elena didn't realize she wasn't the first until Martha showed up, tied to the same rock formation. Having been captured weeks earlier, Martha was even weaker. The two women shared their stories and noticed the pattern in the long hours of darkness, whispering to one another when Monroe wasn't present. Monroe had approached them both in the same way. The first act of generosity, the philosophical, discussions, the slow and careful preparation, and the gradual invitation to explore the caves. Before eventually disclosing his true motivations, he patiently and methodically built trust over several months. Eleanor paused, then went on, her gaze focused on a faraway object. Then she recalled that Monroe had appeared different the last time he had gone down into the room where they were held captive. He had an almost feverish excitement and an urgency that had never existed in him before. He claimed to have at last. Realized that all previous attempts had failed because he had not made the necessary sacrifice and that he knew what he needed to do. Over the years, he had brought other women to the caves. He described them as pioneers who had attempted to cross the threshold but were unsuccessful because they were still too rooted in the material world, rather than as victims. Monroe claimed to have recognized his error. It was insufficient to lead others. He had to cross himself in order to make the last voyage. Monroe had temporarily released them from the ropes the night before they were saved. He had provided them with more food and water than they had had in weeks. Both of them were utterly taken aback by his apology. He claimed that he now realized his error and that he had led them there for the wrong reasons, based on faulty interpretations of his own research. Monroe then displayed a little notebook that he always had with him. It contained a thorough map of the caverns, including sections he had spent years mapping and discovering. Additionally, there were directions on how to leave information he had never previously disclosed. He advised them to use that information to get away if something were to happen to him. With a torch in hand, Monroe proceeded down the passageway that led to the subterranean lake. Martha and Eleanor could hear his footsteps reverberating farther and farther away. And then there was just quiet. He never came back. Hours, maybe a day, had passed while they waited. It's difficult to tell in the perpetual gloom. They thought about attempting to flee by following the notebook's instructions. However, they were lost in the caverns and too frail to venture any farther. And just as they were about to give up, they heard voices in the distance, human voices that weren't Monroe's. Bridger and his men eventually located them at that point. Bridger silently took it all in. After noting certain details and asking some clarifying questions, he inquired as to whether Elelonena had any theories regarding what Monroe meant to accomplish in that subterranean lake. After giving a slow shake of her head, she said something that made Bridger tremble. Monroe had discussed submersion and water's role in transformation and state-to-state travel on several occasions. He had cited ceremonies from several ancient cultures that involved submersion in deep water as a means of obtaining visions or transcending to other planes of reality. And when he bid them farewell the previous evening, Monroe made an odd comment, that he would eventually learn what lay beneath that lake, and that if he did come out, he would be a different person. Martha finally spoke in a hoarse voice after waking up during the conversation and listening silently from the bed next to her. Elelonena had left out a detail, which she added. When he last went down, Monroe had a heavy chain, the kind used to restrain animals, wrapped around his body. He had also taken a big stone that he had meticulously examined for hours, choosing from the rock formations in the cave. Bridger recognized the implication right away. Monroe had more in mind than simply plunging into that lake. He was going to sink, and he had no intention of returning. In the days that followed, Bridger put together a group of 10 men, 2 of whom had dive and recovered items from rivers and lakes. He acquired safety gear, more flashlights, and sturdy ropes. He got ready to go back into the caverns, this time using the particular objective of investigating that subterranean lake and learning the truth about Monroe's fate. However, Bridger took a necessary action before departing. He went to see the woman who had first told him about Monroe, Sarah Brennan. He discovered her at her modest house on the outskirts of Millvale, and this time she welcomed him without a veil, her face uncovered by years of guilt and silence. She was informed by Bridger that Elelonena and Martha were still alive and doing well. He witnessed relief wash over her face then. She didn't try to contain her tears. He then informed her that he needed to know every detail about her sister, including how she had met Monroe in the final days before her disappearance in 1889. Sarah talked for hours. She recalled memories she had stored for years, details she had never told anyone. Rebecca, her sister, had been a strong, self-reliant woman who had declined marriage for social reasons alone. Even though it meant living alone and having to deal with the criticism of others, she preferred her independence and self-reliance. Her neighbors. Like everyone else, Rebecca had met Monroe in this manner. He had come to her aid when she most needed it, gaining her trust with perceptive dialogue and sincere concern. Sarah recalled her sister's increasingly laudatory remarks about him, how Monroe was able to comprehend things that other men would never bother to comprehend, how he gave her a sense of worth because of her independence, not in spite of it. At the time, Sarah acknowledged feeling jealous. Her sister appeared ecstatic and passionate about the philosophical discussions she had with Monroe regarding the locations he took her to in the hills. Then, one fall day in 1889, Rebecca just failed to return home. Sarah searched, waited, and begged the police to look into it. Adult women who voluntarily vanished, however, were not given priority at the time. They were thought to have fled and established a new life somewhere else. Sarah was always aware that something horrible had occurred, but he had no evidence, just a suspicion that was dismissed. Additionally, she bore the burden of her silence like a stone on her chest for years, while other women vanished. She was always wondering if she could have stopped it, if she ought to have insisted more or spoken up more. Bridger did his best to console her. He claimed that no one could have predicted the depth of Monroe's obsession and that she had done the best she could in the given situation. Even he thought the words sounded hollow. In actuality, this man had been operating in full view of a whole community for decades, and nobody had. Since no one had really wanted to see, he was stopped. 3 days later, Bridger returned to the caves with a fresh sense of purpose in addition to the necessary gear and seasoned men. Whether Monroe was dead or alive, he had to find him. He had to put a definitive end to this tale, not only for the sake of justice but also for the families who were left without answers, and the women whose fates were left in the dark for a very long time. Several hours were spent descending to the underground lake. The route was dangerous, even with adequate preparation, and draining. Bridger experienced the same chill his men had mentioned when they eventually arrived at the circular chamber with its still, black waters. Something about that location had a profoundly primordial effect on people, a sense of depth and immensity that transcended the material world. On the lakefront, the items remained grouped in a circle, 12 sets of personal items, each symbolizing a life that was cut short and a tale that would never come to a natural conclusion. Bridger requested that his men gather everything. Cautiously. They had to give those things back to their families. They had to be treated with the dignity they merited. After that, he focused on the water. He brought 2 divers, and they started getting ready. They checked their gear, fastened long ropes around their waists, and lit underwater-specific flashlights. It was an easy strategy. Following the chamber's wall, they would descend while staying in constant contact with the rock and investigating the area as far as it was safe to do so. The first diver cautiously made his way in. The water. The temperature was so frigid that it immediately left you speechless. He gestured with his hand and started to sink, his flashlight producing a fading halo of light. Counting the seconds, Bridger and the others observed from the shore while holding the rope. The rope stopped unwinding after maybe 3 minutes. They held out. No indication of coming back. The rope was then gradually being drawn back. The diver was shaking when he eventually emerged from the water after they assisted him in rising to the surface. Fiercely, not merely due to the cold. He stated that he had followed the stone wall down about 15 meters. The lake appeared to be much deeper. Halfway down, he discovered a chain, the same one Martha had mentioned Monroe carrying, caught between the rocks. But his flashlight was unable to reach the bottom. There were traces of fabric, perhaps from Monroe's clothing, affixed to it, and it was securely wound around a ledge, but there was no body. The current disappeared as it moved downward, into the shadows. The diver had attempted to follow it, but his lungs and ears were starting to suffer from the depth, and he had retreated because of something else. He spoke of feeling as though something big was churning in the depths, causing movement in the water beneath him. He acknowledged that it was most likely only subterranean currents, but the utter darkness and the icy cold had persuaded him to go back. The second diver desired to attempt a deeper dive. He was more seasoned, considering that he had dug in far riskier rivers. After a moment of hesitation, Bridger agreed. The man entered the water and swiftly vanished into the darkness after they doubled the safety precautions and tied a longer rope. The wait was considerably longer this time. For many minutes, the rope kept unwinding. When the rope finally stopped, Bridger started to feel uneasy and thought about dragging him back. They held out. Nothing took place. 3 shakes were then applied to the rope, the agreed-upon signal to start removing him when the diver came to the surface, he had a metal box, the kind used to keep important documents waterproof, tied to a big, heavy rock that Monroe would have used to secure himself. Bridger's hands shaking, he picked up the box. Wax was applied to the edges to seal it. He opened the lid after carefully cracking the seal. There was a notebook inside, covered with an oilcloth for protection. Monroe's final journal. Perched on the edge of that underground lake, lit up. The final words Monroe had left for the world were read by Bridger under the flickering light of the torches. The handwriting was hurried and less meticulous than in earlier diaries, as though he were writing against the clock. Monroe started by acknowledging his errors. He insisted that he had never acted cruelly or with the intent to harm, even though he admitted that his actions had destroyed lives and caused suffering. He sincerely thought he was investigating the limits of human understanding and looking for solutions to problems that both traditional science and religion disregarded. He talked about his experiences in that room over the years, including his feelings of detachment and his deep meditation visions. He described the lake as though it were a living thing, a doorway to something that was beyond our current understanding. He also acknowledged that he had not realized the true nature of what he was looking for, which is why his attempts to bring others through that portal had failed. The diary's final pages were distinct, more concentrated, and more, sort of lucid. Monroe claimed to have at last realized that the journey must be made alone, that no one should cross it on behalf of another, that each person must make their own decisions, and that he had made his own. He went into clinical detail about his plan. After tying the chain around his body and fastening the heavy stone to it, he would allow himself to sink to the lake's bottom. What he would discover down there was unknown to him, maybe just drowning in dark water. Maybe something more, but he was eager to learn. The last entry was written in firm handwriting and was only 1 line long. If anyone discovers this, know that I came voluntarily in search of answers that can only be found in the dark. Bridger closed the notebook slowly. As he gazed at the lake's black, motionless surface, he could picture Monroe plunging into those depths and making the conscious decision to let go rather than struggle or attempt to breathe. It had a very depressing quality. A whole life squandered looking for purpose in places where death and emptiness were the only things present. He had looked down, according to the diver who had brought up the box. He hadn't made it to the bottom, but the current kept going down, catching on the rock. Simply put, the depth was too great for humans to reach without specialized equipment. Monroe would stay there indefinitely if he was down there. It was then that Bridger decided something. Monroe's body would never be recovered again. To be honest, he saw no use in it, and the risk was too great. And putting more lives at risk for a man who had made that decision on purpose. Monroe would stay where he had decided to be, and the lake would keep its secret. Bridger considered it a peculiar form of justice, but the only one that could be applied in the situation. Bridger asked his men to seal the passage leading to the chamber before they left. They blocked the tunnel so that no one else could easily descend by using stones and homemade mortar made from minerals found in the cave. It wasn't an impenetrable barrier, but it would be sufficient to deter inquisitive bystanders and avert further mishaps. Upon their eventual return to the surface, night had returned. Despite the human dramas taking place beneath the earth, the stars continued to shine over the Pennsylvania hills. Feeling as though he were waking up from a months-long nightmare, Bridger inhaled deeply in the cool night air. He devoted the next few days to the delicate work of informing the families. He personally went to each one, bringing the items found in the subterranean chamber. These were tearful talks that had been suppressed for years. Some families reacted angrily, demanding to know why no one had conducted a thorough investigation at the time and why it had taken so long. Others just said they were thankful for having some sort of closure at last, even if it was only partial. Sarah Brennan was given her sister Rebecca's locket, which was a delicate silver object containing a tiny portrait. For several minutes she held it in her hands and stroked its surface as if there was any way she could use it to touch her sister. She then questioned Bridger about whether Rebecca had been harmed by Monroe. Bridger was careful about what he said. He claimed that he thought Monroe had persuaded those women to accompany him voluntarily, and that rather than being violent in the conventional sense, he was a manipulator who used words and deceptive promises. What he really thought had happened to those women who never came back was not mentioned. There were dark possibilities and theories that he, would rather not explore out loud. It's possible that Monroe led them to that subterranean lake and persuaded them to take part in a submersion rite that they never returned from. Maybe he had left them to perish from starvation and thirst in the cave's depths. Maybe the bodies were still lying in other rooms, in other locations they never discovered. In actuality, they would never be certain. And maybe that was a good thing. While some families required conclusive responses, others only required authorization to relocate. Forward, and Bridger made every effort to provide them with that. Elelena and Martha kept up their gradual but steady recuperation. According to Dr. Harrington, although their physical condition was improving, they were gaining weight and regaining strength. The psychological damage was more severe and would take much longer, if at all, to heal. They both suffered from persistent nightmares. Because of her severe phobia of enclosed spaces, Elelena was unable to enter any room without a window without becoming anxious. Martha had grown extremely suspicious of men, particularly those who made an effort to be helpful or kind. Over the next few weeks, Bridger made frequent visits to them, always accompanied by the patient and courteous Dr. Harrington. He wasn't in a rush, but he needed official statements from them to close the case. Until they were ready, he would wait as long as it took. Almost a month after the rescue, Martha finally asked to testify in full. She claimed that doing this was necessary and that it was a necessary part of her recuperation. Everything into words in order to turn the trauma into a story that she could store and forget. As she detailed every aspect of her capture and imprisonment, Bridger listened intently. In the months that Monroe had been preparing her, Martha recalled the lengthy talks she had had with him. He talked about loneliness and how society didn't understand those who had different perspectives and wanted more than the typical life provided. Martha, who was widowed and alone on her estate, had a strong connection to these themes. Words. For the first time in years, she felt understood. Gradually, Monroe had invited her to visit the caves. First, the surface areas, which are safe but stunning and impressive. He described geological formations and related tales of ancient peoples who were said to have worshipped in those caves. Martha was enthralled, and she readily agreed when he eventually proposed that she take part in a unique ceremony that very few people had the opportunity to witness. She only became aware of the error once she was in the deep chamber, already bound. Before the final ritual, Monroe calmly explained that she would need to go through a period of purification, which could take weeks or even months, but was necessary. Martha had attempted to argue, beg, and eventually scream, but Monroe had remained unresponsive, paying her sporadic visits, bringing little food or water, and discussing preparation and patience. Martha claimed that the fear of dying there was not the worst thing, nor was the cold or hunger. The worst aspect was the complete isolation in between visits from Monroe, the complete blackness that eliminated all sense of space and time. Eventually, the sounds of dripping water started to resemble voices, the sensation that she was disintegrating and losing her identity. Martha was first relieved to have company when Elelena, who was also incarcerated, arrived, but her relief soon gave way to horror when she saw that Monroe was repeating the pattern, allowing another woman to be duped. The pair had shared stories and kept each other sane and mentally present by whispering to one another during the long hours of darkness. Then Monroe was different. Martha said she wasn't sure if he truly regretted the last visit, when he apologized and freed them from the ropes, or if he just realized that his experiment had failed once more. Maybe he realized at last that he couldn't make others adopt his warped perception of the world. Everything was painstakingly documented by Bridger when Martha was done, he thanked her for having the guts to disclose something so painful. Then he posed a question to her that had been on his mind for weeks. Was she okay with him going public with the case? In an attempt to create a dramatic story that would sell thousands of copies, the Pittsburgh newspapers had been demanding more information. Martha pondered for a while before responding. At last, she declined. Her life should not be reduced to headlines in the newspapers. She didn't want to go down in history as the woman who had fallen prey to the lunatic in the cave. All she wanted was to try to start over in peace, away from the limelight and people's morbid curiosity. Elena, who was consulted, was fully on board. After giving it some thought, Bridger agreed to honor their wishes, which were to file the case quietly and without public acclaim. He wrote thorough official reports that were submitted to the county, but he refrained from giving the media dramatic details. He merely affirmed that the women who had gone missing had been discovered alive, that the case was closed because the offender had died. Of course, there were complaints. Bridger resisted journalists' claims that the public had a right to know. He had come to the conclusion that some stories didn't need to be told in all of their organized details. Only those directly involved may be able to access certain truths that are hidden away in dusty files. On the county's orders, the abandoned property where the first tunnel was discovered was completely destroyed by fire. Concrete was used to seal off the main cave's entrance, and a warning sign was put in place, warning people about the risks of collapse. What had really been down there was not mentioned. Eventually, Martha sold her land and relocated to a small town in western Pennsylvania where nobody was familiar with her or her background. Bridger never found out where Elena went, but she remained in Millvale for a few more months before departing as well. Both simply left the area, this time voluntarily, in search of new beginnings in locations where the past would not follow them. The ensuing years were characterized by a profound quiet. That took up residence over the hills north of Pittsburgh. For 10 more years, Bridger served as sheriff of Allegheny County, handling routine crimes, neighborhood conflicts, small-time theft, and occasionally more significant cases. However, nothing came close to the gloomy months of 1901 and 1902. He had undergone a profound transformation as a result of that encounter, one that would not go away. Monroe's diaries were kept in a locked drawer in his office. Sometimes, late at night, when the building was quiet and deserted, he would remove them and read some of the passages again, not for morbid enjoyment or unhealthy curiosity, but because he felt a strange obligation to comprehend that man, to comprehend how someone could become so engrossed in their own warped thoughts that they would lose all sense of their fundamental humanity. In a conventional sense, Monroe had not been a monster. He wasn't motivated by anger or a desire to hurt people. In a sense, he was worse, having developed a complex philosophical framework to support horrible deeds, who sincerely thought he was looking for crucial information. And more than any nightmare about underground lakes or shadowy caverns, that realization plagued Bridger. He thought about the missing women a lot. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, Rebecca, Sarah Brennan's sister, and the other 10 women whose names she had found in the old files simply disappeared like smoke. It's likely that their bodies remained somewhere in that underground maze, in unexplored chambers, in depths that would never be reached. Bridger occasionally dreamed of those dark, quiet places beneath the earth, guardians of secrets no one else would ever learn. He pondered how everything would gradually return to nature, how time and water would erase even the last remnants of those interrupted lives. This idea was profoundly melancholic, but it also had a calming quality. Although Sarah Brennan never fully recovered from her sister's passing, she managed to. Of peace following Bridger's return of the medallion. She started going to the neighborhood church more frequently, finding comfort in a group of women who had experienced various forms of loss. Years later, Bridger found out that she had left the hills that were the source of so many painful memories to live with a cousin in Ohio. Over time, the other victims' families responded in different ways. The lack of bodies of conclusive evidence was never accepted by some. They had irrational expectations that maybe their aunts, sisters, and daughters were alive somewhere, either imprisoned by some unexplained circumstance or suffering from amnesia. Others arranged private memorials, found ways to commemorate memories without the need for actual graves, and accepted the partial closure that Bridger had provided. Slowly, the area itself evolved. The hills where the caves were once located gained notoriety as a dangerous area. The hunters who used to roam those trails started to take different routes. Lumberjacks operated in farther flung regions, the properties that are isolated, that were scattered throughout the area were all abandoned. There was safety in numbers as their families moved closer to towns and villages. And as time went on, the tale started to become legendary. Individuals who had not witnessed those events and were only aware of fragmented accounts that were whispered to them started to add their own interpretations. Instead of referring to the caveman as a deeply troubled man, they spoke of him as a supernatural being. They spoke of the caves as though they were cursed locations, touched by forces incomprehensible to humans. Bridger heard these tales with a mix of resignation and annoyance. He recognized that people needed to turn horror into story, to domesticate it through mythology, even though the truth was unsettling enough without the need for fantastical embellishments. It served as a means of handling something that would otherwise be too burdensome. At 62 years old and burdened by decades of public service, Bridger eventually retired in 1915. He used his. Last years, they lived in a modest home on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, where they tended a small garden and occasionally had visits from old co-workers who wanted to catch up on old times. However, he hardly ever discussed the Monroe case, and when he did so in an ambiguous and impersonal manner. Only on one occasion did he discuss it candidly. An aspirational young reporter found him on an autumn afternoon in 1919 and knocked on his door to request an interview. The young man had discovered historical allusions to the case in the county archives and was fascinated by the dearth of information available to the public. Decades later, I wanted to write an investigative piece to uncover the truth. The young man persisted despite Bridger's initial refusal, and eventually the elderly sheriff agreed to speak under one condition. During his lifetime, nothing he said would be published, and even after his death, it should be presented in a way that preserved the victims' identities. The reporter concurred, and for 3 afternoons in a row, Bridger told the whole tale. He talked about the diaries, the caves, Monroe, and the warped philosophy that had driven that man into the dark. He talked about Martha and Alelanina, and how brave they were to live through it and start over. He talked about the families who lost loved ones and were never able to find a satisfactory solution. And he discussed the frailty of humanity, how each of us must walk a tightrope between connection and loneliness, between reason and insanity. The reporter took careful notes, took in everything, and he never published the story, but he thanked Bridger for his trust when he was done. The reporter, now a respected editor, would explain years after Bridger's death that he had come to the conclusion that some stories were better left unsaid, that there was merit in letting some horrors lie in the dark, known only to those who had to know. The caverns were still closed. There were occasionally minor collapses that revealed new openings, particularly during times of intense rain. Every time, the local government promptly kept the area confined by resealing them. The forest fully reclaimed that area over the years. Over the wounds in the ground, trees grew. Over time, the old paths were obscured by dense bushes, making it nearly impossible to identify the precise locations of the entrances. Whatever Monroe had brought with him to the depths was protected by the black waters of the underground lake, which remained unaltered. It was never properly explored by any modern expedition. The expense and risk were not justified by the lack of scientific interest, and the local government chose to keep the area untouched. People who lived nearby sometimes claimed to have heard strange sounds coming from that direction, low murmurs that were almost imperceptible. These sounds could have been the wind blowing through rock crevices, but they could also have been something more, especially on winter nights when the wind howled through the pine trees on the hills. Nobody looked into it too much. They concluded that some things were better left alone. Martha lived to be 74 years old in 1947. She got married again in her new city to a compassionate carpenter who never questioned her about her background. Their 2 daughters were never fully aware of their mother's survival as they grew up. Only in the most private moments did Martha occasionally share those memories with her husband, but she kept them to herself. Helena left Pennsylvania and vanished from the annals of history when the blackness of the night brought back memories of those weeks spent in the caves. There are hints that she might have visited the West Coast, which could have altered her name, and began from the beginning. Nobody can say with certainty whether she found serenity or lived a life plagued by trauma. Sometimes the lack of information is a reaction in and of itself, a deliberate decision to live only in the present and forget the past. Few of the impacted family's descendants are aware of the full story, but they still reside in the area. It was a family secret that was purposefully not passed down from generation to generation and eventually vanished. Time. Sometimes a name leads to research in county archives, or someone finds old references in family documents, and tidbits of information surface, only to be forgotten and filed away again. The human drama that took place in their depths has no effect on the hills. They are still only hills with thick forests, carved by frozen streams, and dotted with rocky outcrops that were there millions of years before anyone ever set foot there, and will be there for millions more. Nature has this freeing quality of perspective that serves as a reminder of our shortcomings and transient nature. And Monroe lies somewhere beneath those hills in dark waters that never see light. It will never be known whether he found the answers he was looking for, whether he achieved the transcendence he so desperately wanted, or whether he just met the icy final emptiness of death. Maybe that's how it fits. Some mysteries are unsolvable. There are some questions that have no good answers. What's left is fragmented and imperfect memory stored in forgotten files and dusty diaries. Perhaps a lesson about the frailty of the human mind, how loneliness can warp perceptions, how the pursuit of meaning can lead us to unreachable places, and how we should be cautious of people who offer purpose where there is only emptiness or simple answers to challenging questions. Nowadays, the residents of that area hardly ever consider the sealed caverns beneath their feet. They live their regular lives, worry about common issues, and find happiness in small things, all of which are appropriate. Life never stops, moving past the challenges of the past like water around stones in a stream. However, a piece of that sinister knowledge is now carried by those of us who have heard this tale. We are aware that there are depths beneath the calm, everyday surface of normalcy that we would never suspect. That extraordinary obsessions can be held by regular people. That there is darkness not just in forests and caverns, but also within us, requiring only favorable conditions to manifest. Perhaps that is the real lesson to be learned from this case that haunted Pennsylvania's hills over a century ago. Not about monsters or cursed locations, but about the value of interpersonal relationships, community, and mutual support. Because those women were vulnerable due to their loneliness. Monroe was able to function covertly because of isolation. The reason that pattern continued to recur for so long was a lack of collective attention we reside in. Monroe could never have predicted the technological advancements of today, with communication systems that make it impossible to completely vanish. However, the basic need to be seen and understood, to belong, and to connect is still present. Additionally, there will always be people who can take advantage of the loneliness and isolation that people experience. If we can learn anything from this story, it's to pay attention, to recognize when someone in our immediate vicinity is having difficulty by themselves, to provide a sincere connection rather than letting others. Make false promises to fill that void, to create communities where people already find meaning in the light and don't need to look for it in the dark. The caverns are still closed off. The lake keeps its secrets to itself. And beneath the wide sky, Pennsylvania's hills continue to be silent. Silent witnesses to tales they would rather not share. However, we have an obligation to remember, not to celebrate the horror, but to grow from it and become better, more aware, and more connected because in. What was lacking was the end. Mutual care, connection, and attention. And each of us can contribute in tiny ways each day to help stop tragedies from happening in the dark in the future. Please show your support by subscribing to this channel if this story had any impact on you, if it caused you to reflect or feel something deep. Leave a comment with your thoughts. The tiniest deeds of human kindness can sometimes prevent the worst tragedies.